Now, welcome to our science lesson, that is standard 8. Today is on 22nd of September 2020. Now, during our last discussion, or our last topic, we talked about the adaptation of mammals. And on adaptation of mammals, we said mammals are adapted in different ways. Now we were looking at the feeding adaptation in mammals, where we discussed the herbivorous, the adaptation of herbivorous to their foods that they eat, the adaptation of the carnivorous to their feeding adaptation as flesh eaters. Now today we are going to discuss partly on the omnivorous, that is the adaptation of the omnivorous, because during our last discussion we didn't cover the omnivorous. Now, and the omnivorous, we say these are animals that are now, they are mammals specifically, that are adapted to now feeding on specifically on flesh and vegetables. So they are adapted to feed on flesh and vegetable and flesh. So what are the adaptations that help these animals to survive? Now the examples of these omnivorous are: number one, the human beings, that is us. We have the chimpanzees, we have monkey, we have pigs. These are the specific animals that fall under omnivorous. Now we are also going to now to discuss the adaptations. What are the adaptations? Number one, we say they have the teeth. Now looking at the teeth, we say they have the following type of teeth. Now when you are discussing under human beings, the teeth, we talked about the human beings have the incisors, they have the canines, they have the molars and the premolars. Now what are the adaptations of these incisors, canine, molars and premolars towards their feeding? Number one, we say the incisors, they have the front, they appear on the front. When you observe your mouth, you will have the teeth that are just on front of the mouth, is what we call the incisors. They are on both jaws, that is the lower jaw and the upper jaw. Now we say they are small, then they are chisel shaped. This one helps them for cutting. They help them for cutting, biting, hipping, and also nibbling of food. So the incisors are the one that help us to cut food, also to bite if we want to bite anything, then also for hipping and also nibbling of food. Now we talk to our canine, the adaptation of the canine. We say they are sharp, pointed. Now when the canine comes immediately after the incisors, they are in fact exactly immediately after the incisors, or they are between the molars and the incisors. So their main adaptation, they are sharp, they are pointed and strong. These ones help them for just to tearing of food, and also gripping and piecing out of food from either if they will have to eat the flesh, so for piecing out of food from the bones. Now the adaptation of the molars and premolars, we say they are found on the back of our mouth. So the incisors, we say they are on the front, then the premolars and molars are on the back of the mouth. Now they have identical ridges. I said the ridges, these are they are just on the teeth. Now if I can draw an example of a premolar teeth, now on the upper surface of these teeth, you get that now they have what we call the ridges. Now also they are broad. The broadness helps it now to crush, for crushing and chewing of the food that is eaten by this animal. So the function of these premolars and molars, you discussed them during your teeth topic. So you say they are used for chewing, crushing, and also grinding of food. Now apart from looking at the teeth and the adaptation of the teeth, we also look at now what do other animals have that help them now to eat these vegetable and also to feed on flesh. Now when you look at some have long tail. Examples of mammals or omnivorous that have this type of adaptation, they are the monkey and also the gorilla. These one have very long tail. This tail help this animal so that now it can hold itself on the branches. When it jumps from one branch to another, the tail helps this animal to hold itself on that branch. Also they have what we call long limbs. These long limbs, they help them for climbing. Now when it wants to climb to another tree, either to look for another food, we say now they have these long limbs that help this animal to move from one zone to another. Then on the they have also fingers. These fingers help them for griping, when they gripe and grasp this food. So the fingers help the animal to gripe, so that now it can take the food into their mouth. So when you look at your hands, you will get that you have fingers. These fingers help us to hold and also gripe the substances that we are supposed to eat. Now, today also we are going to cover the part of feeding adaptation in birds. So this is the last part of the feeding adaptation in mammals. We talked of carnivorous, omnivorous, and lastly we have discussed omnivorous. Now, feeding adaptation in birds. Now, when you want to look at the feeding adaptation in birds, we base on either we look at the feeds of the animal, the bird, and also we look at the beaks. We look at the beaks, that's the beaks, and also we look at the feed modification. We look at the beaks and feed modification. Now, these animals are divided into 4 main groups. Now, we discuss them as either a grain eater. We also group them as either flesh eater. And thirdly, we discuss them as nectar feeder, and lastly, we discuss them as filter feeder. So every bird has its adaptation that help it, so that we can call it a grain eater, we can call it a grain eater, a flesh eater, a nectar feeder, or a filter feeder. We are going to discuss the adaptations that help these birds to be grouped in different groups. Now, first we are going to discuss about the grain eater. Now, what are grain eaters? From just the term grain, it means they feed on grains. Examples, we have the chicken, we have dove, we have turkeys, we have pigeon, we have weaver birds, and also we have the quail birds. So these birds, this group of birds are called grain eaters because they feed on grain. Example of grain, we have maize grain, and other types of grains. Now, the feeding adaptation of the grain eaters. Number one, they have what we call the strong, short, and straight, thick, blunt, and cone-shaped beaks. We say they have short. So if you come here, I've managed to draw an example. So when you come here, we say it is short. This beak here is short. Then we say also it is strong. It is strong, and also we said it is also thick and cone-shaped. When you look at the end part of this, it forms what we call a cone. When you draw a cone, that is an example of a cone. So it is cone-shaped, meaning it is short and cone-shaped. So this one is what we call a cone called shape. So that is the description of the beak of this field grain eater. Now, what are the function of this beak being short, being thick, and being conical shaped? Now, we say this adaptation helps this bird so that now it can pick grain or seeds. For it to pick grain or seeds, it should have this adaptation of the beak. Now, it also have what we call the claws. We said we discussed considering the mouth or the beaks, or we consider the feet. Now, when you look at the feet of these birds, you may get, if you can have an example, you may get that now at the end of any toe of this bird, you get that it has what we call a claw. These claws help these animals to scratch. That's why we call them the scratching birds. So the claws at the end of these animals' toes, we get that now it helps them to scratch. When they scratch down there, they look for food, and also they look for seed from the soils. That's all about the grain eater. We move to flesh eaters. From the term flesh, it means they feed on flesh or meat. So the examples of these flesh eaters, we say they are hawks, we have eagles, kites, and also we have what we call the falcons. So these ones are said to be flesh eaters because they feed on meat or flesh. What are the adaptation of these animals' beak? Number one, we say it has a short, strong, thick, sharp, and hook. When you say hook, it is curved at the end of the mouth, of the beak. It's curved, so it is hooked or curved. Then the beak also helps this animal for what? It helps the animal for cutting and tearing of flesh. So when you come here as an example of these flesh eaters, these are an example of a flesh eater's beak. So when you observe here at the end of it, it is curved. So this one, you say it is curved. We say it is strong, and also we say the adaptation of it being strong and also being curved at the end, it's just for cutting and tearing of this flesh. Now, apart from discussing the beak, we can also discuss the eyesight. When you talk of the acute eyesight, now the acute eyesight helps this bird so that now it can see the prey when it is very far. When the bird, for example, when you look at an eagle can be very far on the cloud, but now it observes that now we have either a chick somewhere, so it will land there from very far. It will have to see that flesh, or it will have to see that prey. So we say it has a very sharp eyesight or acute eyesight. This one is just spotting of their prey from a very far distance. Then also we talk of the others. They feed on dead decaying animals or dead decaying meats. Now this one we are called the meat that is fed on that this animal they are called the carrions. Now example of the carrions are the vulture. So the carrions are this a type of birds that now they feed on dead decaying flesh. They are called carrion, and the example is what we call the vulture. Now another one, we talk of half strong, sharp and curved. We talk of curved, hooked claws. So when you discuss of the claws, for example, if we have these the feed of a flesh eater, you may get that at the end of the toe it has a very strong and curved, this is what we call the claw. So this claw is very strong and curved. This one helps this bird for tearing of the flesh. That is a holding of the flesh and tearing it. That's why now you can wonder why is it that now an eagle can be able to take away a chick from birds, then it moves away with it, because of this strong and curved claws that helps them now to move away with the flesh. Now these claws are called the talons. These claws are called the talons. That is all about the flesh eaters, which are also called the prey eaters. Now we move to nectar feeder. That is a third, that is number C, that is nectar feeder. Now from the term nectar, this means it feeds on nectar. So when we're talking about flowers, we say we have flowers that produce nectar. So these nectars, we have birds that now feed on that nectar. I remember when we were discussing pollination, we said that now we have those birds that helps us for pollination. Now, example of these birds that help us for pollination, they are the sunbird. We have the hummingbird. These two birds, they feed on nectar. Now, how do they be able to feed on this nectar that is found deep or down on the base of the flower? Now we say number one, they have a long, slender or thin, slight curved beak. Now it is long. Why? So that it can be able to go deeper into the flower. So this is a very long, it is a long beak. This beak, at the end of it, it is curved. So it is curved at the end slightly, then it's also very thin, so that now it can enter deep. If this is a flower here, so it will be able to enter until it reaches the base where we have what we call the nectar. So hence the name nectar feeder. They also say, this helps them for sucking nectar from the flower. It helps them, this beak helps this bird for sucking the nectar from the flower. Now that's all about the nectar feeder. We move to the last part, that is the last adaptation group of the birds. We say we have what we call the filter feeders. Now when you talk about filter feeders, from the term filter, it means they filter food from the mud or from water. So we say they feed from that filtering food from mud. Now example of these birds that filters food from the mud, we have what we call the ducks, we have the seagulls, we have the geese, the pelicans, and also we have the flamingos. So when you get a flamingo, mostly they are found on the coastal regions and also on the areas where we have mud. You may get a lot of flamingos. For example, at Magadi, you may get so many flamingos there. Why? Because now they feed on the mud. They are adapted to living in such zones where they can now filter food from that mud that is in the area. Now their adaptation, the beak of this bird, it is flat. then it is broad. They are broad, then strong, serrated. So we are going to discuss about serration. I'll have to give explanation on that. Then the beak is flat, broad, and serrated. Why? The serrations helps to remove the food from the mud. So when the water is passing, the mud is passing through the beak. You made that now the serrations eliminates the mud while it leaves the food that is required to that animal. Now, this one is helped for sieving and filtering of the food from the mud. I've already elaborated that. Now, when you look here, this is an example of a filter feeder. We said it has a very broad mouth. So when you look at the length from here to here, we say this length is what we say broadness. This is the broadness of this beak. We say it has serration. Serrations, these are saw-like structures that are found on the beak of this bird. So these are the saw-like structures, what we call the serrations. Then we say now it is flat. When you move, you look at this beak here, these serrations are there, but now the beak is flat. Their beaks are on the same line. That means they are flat. So that is why we say it has a flat, broad, and strong serrated beaks that helps it for sieving and filtering of food from mud. Then we said already serrated means they have V-shaped or saw-like structures. I've already elaborated to that. Now we say when you observe the feet of this bird, we say they have webs, or they are webbed. We say they have webs or webbed. Now, when you observe here, this is the drawing of a filter feeder bird. So when you observe here, it has this part here. The part that is found in between the toes of this bird. For example, this is my toe. Then you made that now we have such structures that are in between the fingers of these birds. Now this bird here, these ones that are the one that we call webs. So these are what we call the webs. Now these webs, what is the need of these webs to these birds? The webs help this animal for wading and also for swimming. Wading is just similar as swimming, so that now the animal can be able to move in mud and also on water, so that now it can get what it needs from the water or from the mud. So they are also called swimming birds because of this type of webs that they have on their feet. Now, this is all about the adaptation of the birds, and also this is all about today's discussion. So generally, you have to understand the types of birds, the groups of birds considering their feeding modifications. When you consider the feeding modification, you have to understand the grain eater, you have to understand the beak of the grain eater, you have to understand what they feed on. Also, you have to understand their function. Why is it short? Why is it conical shaped? So that now you can move on and have your easier time during your examination. Also, you have to understand the flesh eaters. You have to understand the adaptation of the flesh eater. You have to understand the example of the flesh eaters. You have to understand their adaptation, and also have to understand both the feet and the beak adaptation. Then you have also to understand the nectar feeder, have the adaptation, have the examples, and also you have to get it very clear to why it has a long, slender, and also a slight curved beak. There we have already said that it is for sucking of the nectar. And also I have elaborated it and said it is also helps for pollination, because when it takes nectar from one flower, it moves to the second flower. It means it has transferred the pollen from one flower to another flower, hence causing what we call cross-pollination. Then we have also the filter feeder. You have to get to understand all the adaptation of the filter feeder, the serration, and their importance to that bird. So that is all about today's discussion. That's all about today's discussion. Let's meet during our next discussion, inshallah.